Dr. Elena Romano's hands didn't shake anymore. Not during surgery, not when a patient flatlined, not when she had to tell a family their loved one didn't make it. 15 years as a cardiothoracic surgeon had burned the trembling out of her fingers and replaced it with steady precision that saved lives. But on a cold February night in 1955, standing in the scrub room of Mount Sinai Hospital in New York City, looking through the glass at the 7-year-old boy dying on the operating table with a bullet fragment lodged in his heart, Elena's hands started to shake for the first time in a decade. Not because of the surgery. She'd done hundreds of procedures more complex than this one. The bullet fragment was close to the left ventricle, but accessible. Delicate work, but within her capabilities. The surgery itself didn't scare her. What scared her was the boy's last name, Castellano, the same last name as the man who'd asked her to marry him 10 years ago, the man she'd rejected in front of his entire family, the man who'd told her she was making the biggest mistake of her life. And now that man was sitting in her waiting room with 50 of his soldiers, waiting to see if she'd save his son's life. The son he'd had with the woman he'd married after Elena said no. The son of the most powerful crime boss in New York City. What Elena didn't know yet, as she forced her hands to stop shaking and walked into that operating room, was that the next 6 hours would determine more than whether a little boy lived or died. They would determine whether New York's underworld went to war, whether 200 families turned against each other, whether the fragile peace that had held the 5 families together for a decade would shatter. All because 10 years ago a young woman had chosen her dreams over a man's love, and now that choice was coming back in the form of a dying child who didn't deserve to pay for his father's sins, or hers. Elena Romano had grown up in Little Italy, the daughter of a tailor and a seamstress, smart, ambitious, with a mind that could memorize entire anatomy textbooks and hands that could thread a needle before she was 6 years old. Her parents had encouraged her education, even when the neighbors said it was a waste to send a girl to college. She'd attended Hunter College on scholarship, then somehow, impossibly, gotten into Columbia Medical School in 1937. One of 3 women in a class of 80. She'd graduated top of her class in 1941, right as the war started. While the men went overseas, Elena had stayed and worked, first as an intern, then a resident, then finally a surgeon. The war had been good for her career, in a terrible way. With male doctors in short supply, hospitals had been forced to give women opportunities they'd never had before. Elena had performed her first solo surgery in 1943, removing shrapnel from a sailor's chest. She'd been terrified and brilliant, and the sailor had lived. By 1945, she was one of the most respected cardiothoracic surgeons in New York. By 1950, she was running her own surgical team at Mount Sinai. She'd sacrificed everything for her career, marriage, children, any kind of normal life. But she didn't regret it. She saved lives. That mattered. Then, in 1945, right after the war ended, she'd met Marco Castellano at her parents' anniversary party. Marco was different from the neighborhood boys she'd grown up with. He was smart, well-read, could discuss opera and philosophy as easily as boxing and baseball. He dressed beautifully, spoke 3 languages, had a smile that made Elena forget she was supposed to be too busy for romance. He was also, she learned later, the son of Salvatore Castellano, one of New York's most powerful mafia bosses. Marco was being groomed to take over the family business, but he wanted more than that. He wanted legitimacy, respect, a life beyond the shadows his father operated in, and he wanted Elena. They dated for 6 months. Secret meetings at restaurants in other neighborhoods, long walks through Central Park, conversations that lasted until dawn. Marco had been different when they were alone, vulnerable, uncertain, talking about dreams of going legitimate, of using his family's wealth to build legitimate businesses, maybe even going into politics. I could be more than what my father made me, he'd said once, with the right woman beside me, someone strong, someone who isn't afraid of what we are. Elena had known what he was asking before he even asked it, and when he finally proposed, in front of his entire family at a Sunday dinner in 1945, she'd known what her answer had to be. I can't, she'd said quietly, aware of every eye in the room on her. I've worked too hard to become a surgeon. If I marry you, I become a wife, a mother, that's all. I lose everything I've built. Marco's face had gone cold. You're choosing a career over me, over us? I'm choosing myself, I'm sorry. She'd left that dinner and never saw Marco again. She'd heard he married someone else 6 months later, a nice Italian girl from the neighborhood, someone who'd be content to be a Mafia wife, someone who wouldn't choose herself over him. Elena had told herself she'd made the right choice, and for 10 years she'd believed it. Until tonight, when Marco's son came through her emergency room doors with a bullet in his heart. The call had come at 8 p.m. 7-year-old boy, gunshot wound to the chest, being rushed to Mount Sinai. The family had insisted on Elena specifically, wouldn't accept any other surgeon, would pay whatever it cost. Elena had been reviewing patient charts when her chief resident burst into her office. Dr. Romano, we've got an emergency, GSW to the chest, pediatric patient, families demanding you operate. What's the patient's name? Castellano, Michael Castellano. Elena had felt her blood turn to ice. Tell the family I'm not available. Dr. Patterson can handle it. They won't accept anyone else. And Dr. The resident's voice dropped. There are about 50 men in suits filling up our waiting room. They say they're not leaving until you agree to operate. Elena had closed her eyes. Of course Marco would do this. Of course he'd use his dying son to force her hand. But she couldn't refuse to operate on a child just because of her history with the father. That would violate every oath she'd taken. She'd gone down to the waiting room to see the situation for herself, and there was Marco, 10 years older, but still handsome, his face pale with terror, surrounded by men who looked ready to tear the hospital apart if his son died. Their eyes had met across the crowded room, and in that moment, Elena saw something she hadn't expected. Not anger, not resentment, just desperate, naked fear for his child's life. Please, Marco had said quietly. I know what I'm asking. I know our history. But he's 7 years old, Elena. He didn't choose this life. He's just a little boy who got caught in crossfire. If anyone can save him, it's you. Elena had looked at the chart. Bullet fragment near the heart, surgery required within hours or the boy would die. Complex procedure, not impossible, but challenging. Dr. Patterson was good, but Eleanor was better. Everyone knew it. I'll operate, she'd said, but I need you and your men out of my surgical wing. You can wait here. I'll update you when I can. Marco had nodded. Thank you, Thank you. And now Elena stood in the scrub room, preparing to operate on the son of the man she'd rejected a decade ago, trying to convince herself this was just another surgery, just another patient, just another life to save. But her hands kept shaking. Elena walked into OR3 and looked at the small figure on the table. Michael Castellano was pale, unconscious, intubated. He looked like any other 7-year-old boy, small, vulnerable, innocent. The monitors showed his heart rate dropping, blood pressure unstable. They were running out of time. Let's get started, Elena said, her voice steady even if her hands weren't. Scalpel. The surgery was as delicate as she'd expected. The bullet fragment had lodged between the left atrium and left ventricle, missing the major vessels by millimeters. One wrong move and the boy would bleed out on the table. Elena worked with infinite patience, her entire world narrowing to the small field of operation, her hands moving with the precision that had made her one of the best surgeons in New York. 3 hours in, she ran into a complication. The fragment had caused more damage than the X-rays had shown. Tissue around the heart was torn, bleeding into the pericardial sac. She'd have to repair it while simultaneously removing the fragment, all without stopping the heart completely. "This is going to be close," she murmured. "I need perfect suction, no room for error." Her team worked flawlessly, nurses anticipating her needs, anesthesiologist keeping the boy stable, surgical assistant providing perfect retraction. This was what Elena loved about surgery: the teamwork, the focus, the way everything else fell away except the problem in front of you and the solution in your hands. 4 hours in, she'd successfully removed the fragment and was repairing the damaged tissue. The boy's vitals were stabilizing. He was going to make it. 5 hours in, she was closing. The surgery had been successful. Michael Castellano would live. 6 hours after she'd started, Elena stripped off her gloves and walked out of the OR. Her team was exhausted, but triumphant. They'd saved a child's life. That was what mattered. But now came the hard part, facing Marco. He was still in the waiting room, now alone, except for 2 men who stood like guards at his back. The other 48 had been sent away, probably to avoid attracting more police attention. Marco stood when he saw Elena, his face desperate. "Is he? He's alive. The surgery was successful. He'll need to stay in intensive care for a few days, but barring complications, he should make a full recovery." Marco's knees actually buckled. He grabbed the back of a chair for support, his face crumbling. Elena had never seen him cry, not in all the months they'd dated. But he was crying now, silent tears streaming down his face. "Thank you," he whispered. "God, Elena, thank you. I'm just doing my job." "No." Marco wiped his eyes and straightened. "You did more than your job. After how we ended, you could have refused, could have let another surgeon handle it, but you didn't. You saved my son's life." Eleanor felt something twist in her chest. "He's a child. I would never let a child die because of our history." "I know. That's why I asked for you specifically. Because I knew you wouldn't." Marco took a step closer. "Can we talk? Please, just 5 minutes." Elena knew she should say no, knew nothing good could come from this conversation, but she was exhausted, emotional, and part of her wanted answers to questions she'd been carrying for 10 years. 5 minutes. They walked to a quiet corner of the waiting room. Marco sat down heavily, suddenly looking much older than 42. "His mother died 6 months ago," he said quietly. "Cancer." Michael watched her waste away, and now this. "Someone tried to kill me and Michael got in the way. He's 7 years old, and he's already seen more death than any child should." "I'm sorry," Elena said, and meant it. "When you said no 10 years ago, I was angry, hurt. I thought you were choosing your career over love, over me. I married Sophia out of spite, maybe, or obligation. My father wanted me to settle down, produce an heir. Sophia was sweet, traditional, everything you weren't, and I was stupid enough to think that would be enough." "Marco, let me finish. Please." He looked at her with red-rimmed eyes. "Sophia was a good wife, a good mother, but she wasn't you. I spent 10 years building the empire my father wanted, becoming the man he groomed me to be. And I was miserable. Because you were right, Elena. If you'd married me, you would have lost everything you'd worked for. I would have taken your dreams and crushed them without even realizing it." Elena sat down beside him. "I'm sorry I hurt you. I never wanted that." "I know, and I'm sorry for how I reacted, for making you choose in front of my entire family. That was cruel." Marco was quiet for a moment. "When Michael got shot tonight, and I knew only you could save him, I thought maybe this was God's punishment, for my pride, for my anger, making me beg the woman I loved and lost to save my son's life. This isn't punishment, Marco, it's just life, complicated and messy and unfair. Will he really be okay?" If he follows the recovery protocol and there are no infections or complications, yes, he'll have a scar and he'll need to be careful for a while. But he can live a normal life. Marco nodded slowly. Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. "This is for you, payment for the surgery. The hospital will bill you." "This is beyond the hospital bill. This is—" He pressed the envelope into her hands. "This is me saying thank you for giving my son a future, for being better than I deserved. Please take it." Eleanor opened the envelope. Inside was a check for $100,000. She stared at it in shock. "Marco, this is too much. It's not enough. My son is alive because of you. I can't put a price on that." He stood. "I need to see him. Even if he's unconscious, I need to see that he's breathing." Elena led Marco to the ICU. Through the glass, they could see Michael in his bed, small and pale, but alive. The machines beeped steadily, monitoring his heart. The heart Elena had just repaired. "He looks like you," Elena said quietly. "He has his mother's eyes, thank God." Marco pressed his hand against the glass. "I'm going to take him away from this life, after he recovers. We're leaving New York, maybe California, somewhere he can be just a kid, not the son of a mafia boss, somewhere he doesn't have to worry about bullets." "That's a good choice. It's what you would do if you were in my position." Marco turned to look at her. "You made the right choice 10 years ago, Elena. I see that now. You became exactly who you were meant to be. And because you did, my son is alive tonight. So thank you for choosing yourself, for becoming Dr. Romano instead of Mrs. Castellano." Elena felt tears forming in her eyes. "I hope you find peace, Marco. You and Michael both." "We will. Far from here." He paused at the door. "I'm putting the word out. You're untouchable now. Every family in New York knows what you did tonight. No one will ever threaten you, your hospital, your patients. You have my protection and the protection of everyone who owes me. For life. I don't need protection. Maybe not, but you have it anyway." Marco smiled sadly. "Goodbye, Elena. Thank you for giving me back my son, and for showing me that some people are exactly where they're supposed to be, even if it's not next to us." 3 months later, Elena heard through the neighborhood grapevine that Marco Castellano had retired from the family business and moved to Los Angeles with his son. He'd sold his interests to his brother and walked away clean. Michael had fully recovered and was attending a regular school, playing baseball, being a normal kid. The check Marco had given her, Elena donated to a scholarship fund for women pursuing medical degrees. She kept operating, kept saving lives, kept being exactly who she was meant to be. And sometimes late at night, she'd think about the choice she'd made 10 years ago, about the life she'd given up, about the man who'd loved her enough to let her go, and then loved his son enough to beg her to come back. She'd made the right choice. She knew that. But knowing something is right doesn't mean it doesn't hurt. Years later, in 1975, Elena received a graduation announcement in the mail. Michael Castellano had graduated from UCLA Medical School. He was going to be a surgeon, specializing in cardiology. The note inside read, "Dr. Romano, thank you for saving my life when I was 7. My father told me the whole story before he died last year. You gave up something precious to become who you are, and because you did, I'm alive to follow in your footsteps. I hope to be half the surgeon you are. With deepest gratitude, Dr. Michael Castellano." Elena kept that note in her desk for the rest of her career, a reminder that every choice we make ripples forward in ways we can't predict, that sometimes the hardest decisions lead to the most beautiful outcomes, that love takes many forms, and sometimes the greatest love is knowing when to walk away and when to come back. She'd chosen herself over Marco, and in doing so, she'd become the surgeon who could save his son, who could inspire that son to become a doctor himself, who could turn one painful choice into a legacy that would save thousands of lives over generations. It wasn't the ending she'd imagined when she said no to that marriage proposal. But it was, she realized, exactly the ending that was meant to be. If this story touched you, watch another tale of impossible choices and redemption. Support us so we can keep sharing these stories about the moments that define us. Your support means everything.